when we talk about education, what are we actually talking about?
Education is more than just schooling. It's really about equipping people to thrive socially, economically, politically. It's more than just the process of acquiring knowledge and skills through various forms of learning. I think education is a fundamental human right and a key driver of sustainable development. Of course, it takes many different forms. You have the formal, structured, state recognized schooling, from primary to secondary to tertiary. You also have the non-formal pathways with community-based programs, vocational training, and accelerated learning. And then, of course, you have the informal learning that happens through daily life, within families, within communities.
And what's unique in my mind about your network is that it has actually not only organizations, but teachers, grassroots groups, and students. So you're talking to people who are on the front line of education every day.
Mhm.
How is it possible to understand education in conflicts and emergencies, not only as the formal, like make a curriculum available and, standardize and build a school? How do we go to those layers that are important, as you said?
Education is life-saving. In the early phase of an emergency, schools are some of the only supervised safe spaces where children can be protected from violence and exploitation and, armed recruitment. Schools, we've seen it over and over again. They act as community hubs and they provide access to other critical services like school meals, psychosocial support, and even access to vaccinations and health programs. We've also seen that for displaced children, education offers a sense of normalcy, a routine. It offers a consistent structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. And I think above all, it offers hope. Like it's more than just survival. And then in the long term, like I said, of course, it gives youth and young and children the skills to rebuild. It fosters social cohesion in societies and it can help prevent future cycles of crisis and displacement.
And talking about disruption, some scholars call it scholasticide, what's happening in Gaza, the absolute systemic destruction of society, including destruction of every educational uh, every educational facility, and the fact that for nearly 2 years now,
Mhm.
from school children to university students have had no education. And I don't, I, this is talked about a lot, so I don't want to just recycle numbers, but I want to ask you whether this complete impunity in which Gaza altogether, but particularly the systemic destruction of universities and schools has happened. Do you fear that is that a sign of things to come? Is that going to be something we fear in the future that hasn't, or has it always been the same? How do you see that in context?
I think Gaza has, in many ways, normalized attacks on education. It has turned schools into targets. It has turned teachers and students into targets. And I mean, it's very much setting the tone for moving forward because anyone can now get away with it. And I remember when we did our consultations with some of the memberships, and we've asked the teachers, what is your message to the world? I remember one teacher, like, and every teacher had different something to say. I remember one teacher from Palestine said, we asked the world to make our schools safe zones again. Like, this is not acceptable. This cannot continue like that. And I think in many ways, Gaza has also really exposed the system within which we all work. I think we now talk about, a reset, a reform, a re-this, but I think we have to change the fundamental system that has allowed this to happen.
There has been a massive cut in budgets through the US, reneging on their commitments towards, humanitarian development, foreign aid. But that is only one of the sides. Most Western countries have had a reduction or a retraction from solidarity politics, including providing resources for humanitarian and development issues. I need to ask you, and I know that you've had a conversation within your network about what does that mean, how does it get tackled, and where does it go forward. Can you give me first an idea of what's the impact of the budget cuts on education in emergencies? What do we know so far for that to has done? We have managed to calculate, for example, the Lancet has calculated mortality of cuts from health issues, but I haven't seen yet coherent evidence to what is happening in education. I'd appreciate your view on that.
I think, firstly, we need to acknowledge that the education sector was chronically underfunded anyway, before the funding cuts. And so you have a sector that has education in emergencies, or even the broader education sector, struggling with chronic underfunding, then hit by these massive cuts. And I mean, you can see with the humanitarian cuts, it's most pronounced in the education sector in comparison to the other sectors. And then I think the other issue to keep in mind is for education in crisis affected countries, the funding didn't just come exclusively from humanitarian budgets, but it also came from the overseas development assistance budgets, ODA. And so that's also being slashed. So the sector is being hit from multiple angles. And like you said, we've done a survey and we've held consultations with our broad membership to understand how is this impacting people on the ground. And we are seeing a really worrying situation emerging, facing all frontline education actors. Like across the board, we're hearing about, reduced programming, cutting staffs, and a lot of the local organizations ceasing operations fully. We're hearing about school closures, increased dropout rates, lack of teacher salaries, and a lot of things. And I can give you a couple of quotes. Like one of our members in DRC said, they've I'm quoting directly. They said, given the recent cuts in humanitarian aids, we've had to close our doors. No funding, or we don't have a subsidy from the government, and that is the real situation. Another member based in Venezuela, a local NGO, said, we're trying to fill the gap with small enterprises, with community contributions, but it's not enough. Another member based in Turkey said, we're trying to seek alternative funding opportunities, but again, the options are limited. Teachers, actually, a teacher in Afghanistan said, we do what we have, we do what we can with what we have. Of course, this is our responsibility in whatever circumstances. We need to keep education going, but we cannot cope alone. A teacher in Cox's Bazar said, I want my students to dream big, no matter what their background is. I have 90 students per class in Cox's Bazar. It is very hard. And so I can keep going. And I think the one that stuck most with me was a teacher in Lebanon who said, teachers alone cannot carry the weight of systemic challenges. And so what's happening, these cuts mean that teachers are being left to carry the weight on their own in classrooms, and communities are left to carry the weight alone in classrooms.
What can be done next? What's the adaptations? How can you and a network like yours tell us and act upon that sort of shortfall of attention to education in general and in emergencies particularly?
Money is not coming back, of course. I mean, a lot of these governments cutting funds aren't going to bring it back. But I think this moment is also more than just about the numbers being cut. I think it's about the narrative being told. Like I remember, I recently sat in a meeting where one government representative was defending her country's decision to cut funding, and they said, "Oh, aid was always a charity anyway." And I think this is where we really need to push back hard as humanitarians, because this is not just a question of charity. This is a question of justice. It's a question of what's owed. And I'm not talking about historical debt and centuries of exploitation. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the climate debt that rich, polluting countries are liable to pay low and lower middle income countries. That by far exceeds anything they pay in humanitarian aid or overseas development assistance. And so I think it's not a charity, it's a fraction of what's owed. And look at my country, Somalia. We are recovering from years of civil conflict, but we're also being hit by the most extreme forms of drought and flooding. And we cannot cope. Like, and honestly, Somalia has not contributed to climate change. So it is not possible for us to finance our own development while also bearing the brunt and the cost of rich nations who've polluted this earth. So I think we also need to be honest that this is more than charity. This is justice and what's owed. That's one thing. And I think then how do we move forward? So we've asked this question to our membership and we've said exactly that. Funding isn't coming back, money isn't coming back. How can we move forward? How can we still make sure that our children are getting quality access to quality education? And the responses from the membership has been mixed. There is the number one response that has come back over and over again was localization. That was the most prevalent theme. It was we need to localize, we need to build on what the local communities and national actors are already doing on the ground. The second biggest response that links to localization was we need to rethink the financing model and we need to rethink the role of national governments and education authorities. And I mean, the membership was really clear. We need to think big. We aid, like you said, is a drop in the bucket, but we need to focus on sustainable domestic financing. This is not to absolve the international community, but national governments should focus on mobilizing domestic resources to finance education, which then means in low income countries, I mean, this requires action on tax, on debt, on austerity. It requires all of us to mobilize to look at how can we change systems that block domestic financing? How can we have fairer global tax rules? How can we have fairer debt architectures? And how can we make sure that education systems are funded well so that they can adapt and respond to crises instead of falling apart? And I think a lot of the people within the wider INEE membership, there was a real reflection on, you know what, in fact, this short-term, unpredictable project-based aid has always been a challenge for the education sector, which requires long-term sustainable financing. And so I think there's a reflection of how do we move forward? We need to really rethink how we finance education, and that requires more than just technical tweaks. We need to rethink the fundamental roles and responsibilities within our systems and structures. And I think this is, yeah, I think we are already seeing that. It was interesting to see that a lot of the membership were already advocating, a lot of the national civil society were already turning inwards to their governments and saying, hang on, you need to step up here. You need to do X, Y, Z. And so maybe my hope is that there will be a way forward that allows us to continue educating our children, whether donors think we should or shouldn't. That's beside the point.